Well, welcome to another episode. It is great to have you here with us, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our guest today. We're going to be talking about negotiating as a woman in a man's world, and it'll cover everything from law to politics and beyond, as you will see here momentarily. So welcome, Christine. It is so great to have you here.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this. This is great.
Likewise. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure and don't know Christine Hart is a force to be reckoned with. That is the best way I can put it. She has absolutely been a pioneer, leading the way for women across multiple disciplines. I mean, her career is inspiring to say the least. She has been a lawyer, a litigator, a facilitator, a mediator, a cabinet minister, a legislator, an author, a teacher, and so much more. She was one of the first women to break into the ranks in top-rated corporate law firms. She upset the political scene, unseating the longstanding conservative who had held the riding. She was then appointed Minister of Culture and Communications, one of the very few women to hold ministerial positions in cabinet at the time. And then that wasn't enough. She became an accredited mediator through Harvard and headed the Supreme Court Alternative Dispute Resolution Pilot Project, then joined KPMG as a partner, and a year later was president of KPMG Conflict Solutions. And then subsequently, she founded Accord Hart and Associates, specializing in conflict management, where she did incredible work across the board. And also, on top of all of that, served as the director and governor of a broad range of not-for-profit boards as well. So let's start, Christine. As an attorney myself, I got to say, I am so intrigued and impressed by your remarkable career. It sounds very sexy and dramatic, and I'm sure it didn't feel that way at times, but if you can tell us about your own journey in your own words.
Well, as I often say, it sounds like I can't hold a job. To some extent is true.
That's hilarious.
No, I started a long time ago. I am now retired, but I finished law school in 1973. And so it was a few years after that. But just to start that off, in 73, there were very few women. It was in Toronto, lawyers in Toronto, anywhere actually, but in Toronto particularly.
Wow.
And none of us, it was the year when the big firms in Toronto decided they would hire a girl. And so I did get an articling job, but none of us were hired back. So this is a world where if you weren't hired back, there was something wrong with you, something really wrong with you, because people stayed at the same firm forever.
Wow.
And I might have liked to do that too. I probably would have. But because of those circumstances, I learned how to move on, put it that way, be more flexible. And ultimately that was a good thing. At the time, I certainly didn't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. And things were so much more. It's interesting. I find recently, even watching some old shows or shows that are based on it's like, wow, you don't realize how far, like we still have a long way to go, but you don't realize how much things have changed. Like the sexism was so blatant back then. There was much, much less inclination to hide it. Was that your experience?
Absolutely. Actually, law firms were getting to the stage where they were more subtle about it for sure. But I did spend some time in writing and all that sort of stuff in the trucking industry. I appreciated that industry because they wore their sexism on their sleeves. You can deal with that. That has changed too.
Yes. There's something to be said for knowing where you stand, at least, right?
Absolutely.
It's the subtle stuff, the insidious stuff that can be so much more challenging. So what, if any, difference did you find then transitioning from law, like just sort of keeping with this gender-based issue for a moment, the difference between law and as you sort of transitioned into politics?
Politics, it's not really a straight line because there's so many people you're interacting with. First of all, there's the nomination process and the people that you need to sign up and vote for you in order to be the candidate.
Yeah.
Then if you are the candidate and there's an election, then they're the people who you are asking to vote for you.
Yeah.
Then if you're elected, it's the people in the your colleagues. In my case, there were MPPs and the Premier's office and cabinet offices.
Yeah.
So it's not one kind of, I can't say this is the way it was.
Yeah.
There's the community was much more accepting entirely, but much more accepting than certainly parts of the minister's offices, put it that way. But the time was interesting because it was a by-election, my first election, and the issue was separate school funding.
Okay.
with the side of abortion, put it that way.
Yeah.
So the issues were dramatic,
Yeah.
and people were either with you or against you.
Yeah.
And and there weren't that many candidates at my level, for sure. In fact, I'd been discouraged from running. I'd been a lawyer for a number of years.
Yeah.
And I was told by the local bishop, why don't you just go for school trustee or something where you might get elected?
Oh, gosh.
Anyway,
Incredible.
life is funny.
Yeah.
So there were varying levels of, amongst my colleagues in the legislature, that was one of the best jobs I ever had. I mean, you were accepted, and this was another time, obviously. It wasn't so divisive, but I loved that job. I really did.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, you touch on a couple of key things. One is the layers that we often forget, right? These different levels and the interplay between them. People often think of whether negotiations or just navigating these systems as linear, and they're not, right? They're stacked on top of each other. It's like what's that game, Jenga, where you're trying to fit the pieces together and make sure the whole tower doesn't fall over.
Yeah.
Right? So incredible. And my gosh, how did you handle or navigate, Christine? I hadn't realized, like, they were two of the most polarizing issues at that time, right? The whole separate school issue, so deeply culturally ingrained, and obviously the sort of pro-choice versus pro-life debate. What was your experience around sort of having to navigate or negotiate with such polarizing issues on the table?
Well, a little more context. It was the first by-election after David Peterson became premier. So by-elections are sort of an interesting thing by themselves.
Yeah, true.
And the leader of the opposition had decided that he was against separate school funding, although it was his party that brought it in. And it was his protege who was running against me. So there were many layers. In the terms of the election campaign, you kind of had to, and also it was a riding that had been represented by a different party for 44 years or something like that. So nobody thought I would win. Yeah. Even I didn't think I'd win. But I did think that there would be a general election within a short period of time, and I would have two kicks at the can. That's what I did think. Okay. But you had to kind of, when you went to the door, it's a very conservative place, Lee's side, or it was at the time. Yeah. You had to kind of grit your teeth. And it was either, they were either going to excoriate you, or they were going or neutral, which was good, or welcoming, which was even better. Right? That kind of thing.
Okay. Well, actually, as you say that, it strikes me, because this is some amazing lessons that I'm sure you sort of learned, and some of it, knowing you, personally, I think much of it came naturally to you. But what advice do you have for people when you are facing potentially a very unwelcome reception, right? Whether in politics or beyond, even just in business, in personal life, any tips you have? How did you handle that so successfully?
Well, you and I have talked about this. Preparation is key. Yeah. First of all, just to step back a bit, the hardest thing for me, and many women will recognize this, was when someone asked me at the door, or even in the nomination campaign, why do you think you deserve this? Why are you any better than anybody else? Yeah. Now, I was brought up to think I wasn't any better than anybody else. So I choked when I was asked that question the first time. Yeah. And a person who was with me, a very knowledgeable volunteer, took me away and said, okay, now we're going to practice the answer. So you think about what you want to say, what's true for you, and then we're going to say it a number of times. Yeah. And it's the same for going to the door. You will choke if you see this vitriol coming at you, unless you have a bit of muscle memory for something that you want to say, like it comes from you. It's not something that somebody's given you, a talking point or anything like that. But in order to be able to say it, at least most of us need to say it a few times. You know how we tell our kids, this is how you deal with racism, this is how you deal with bullying, that kind of stuff. Yeah. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Well, and so important, as you're saying that, I recognize so much of it for women in particular, we're hampered because we have generational conditioning that we need to keep ourselves small. Don't get too big for your britches. Don't brag on yourself. So it sounds like part of it is going back and doing that inner, sort of, as corny as it sounds, self-love work and overcoming that conditioning that we're not enough. What do
Right. I wish I could have done that.
Yeah.
And actually, was thinking about it because I've just read Michelle Obama's second book.
Yeah.
She talks a lot about that inner stuff. You are good enough.
Yes.
And it's a really good book. I recommend it.
Yeah.
I make no money.
Yeah.
I just want you to know, no conflict of interest.
Well, thanks. Well, as you know, I'm passionate about negotiating, and obviously you've had loads of experience, both from your, in your mediation work, which you sort of led the charge on that, and we'll circle back to that later. But as a lawyer and in politics, I'd love if you could share some of your experiences or maybe tips even about, as a woman in particular, negotiating these predominantly male worlds.
Well, some of it is not different depending on gender, although we bring a different lens to it as women, for sure. The thing that I find most important in a negotiation is listening.
Yes.
And listening, particularly for lawyers and particularly for litigators, is very difficult because we have been trained and socialized, and our peer group wants us to not to listen, to talk, to solve problems, not to let other people, kind of listen so you can find out what their solution is. We want our solution. And that is something that must be overcome, doesn't matter what your gender is. But the listening is the key. And it's hard. Our emotions get in the way. Mine do. The everyday negotiations with your family. Like, I could just keep my mouth shut some of the times and I'd be way better off.
Yeah, I think you really got to the heart of it there on that listening, and particularly on every level, because we do not listen well in North America at all. And I think you're right. The legal profession in particular, we've been very conditioned to define success. You are a successful lawyer if you're the one who is talking the most in the room. If you are talking the loudest and the longest, then you must be doing your job.
Right.
And it takes some soul searching and expression, recognizing your strengths to recognize the opposite is true. That was quite an epiphany and quite a shock for me, frankly. As you know, my clients called me the Barracuda, which they meant as a compliment. And I could not believe the difference when I allowed myself to step back, take the ego out of it. I think for lawyers is a big part of it, and just show up truly seeking to understand the needs of the other party, right? I mean, it was a game changer. And you must see in your role as a mediator, I'd love, since I mentioned ego, what are your thoughts about the role that ego plays in negotiation?
It clearly plays many roles, both as you as the mediator or negotiator of the parties. All of us have ego. How we manage our egos, really, that's key. And I don't know about you, but I have to keep circling back to tell myself that, this is not about you.
Yes.
Yes. Right. This is about other people, and you can help them if you just leave you at the back door, right?
Yeah, that is so true.
It's not easy. It really isn't easy. At least for me. Maybe it's very easy for other people.
No, I think it's not. And I think our entertainment industry doesn't help. I mean, we've got that generational conditioning about how we define success and power. I think it's our relationship to power. Most conflict comes from one party feeling they don't have power. And the problem is, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Christine, like for me, I'm beginning to believe very strongly that the problem is we've been conditioned to look at power as being power over other people rather than looking for power with. That rising tide lifts all boats. How can we help each other to get better outcomes? What was your experience in mediation law or politics about that?
Well, I agree with you entirely. I've been watching one of those old legal shows, and it's a win for everybody if the lawyers kind of trick everybody into doing what they want.
Yes.
And it just doesn't work. I mean, I was going to tell you how I got into mediation. I was a litigator, and I'll circle back to this. And I was on the trial list for 6 months. I was number 1 on the trial list for 6 months. And every week you have to, at the beginning of the week, you have to call all your witnesses to say it's not going to be this week. I was beside myself towards the end. And then I realized I was coming to this anyway. There had to be a better way.
Yeah.
And I went off to politics thinking the better way was to try and deal with laws. And it was to an extent. But after politics, I realized that litigation was not the way. that the only person who really won is the lawyers who get the
Yeah.
fees, and they don't win because everybody hates them, right?
Yeah,
So that's not a win.
Yeah.
Right? Can't remember where I started with that.
You were saying about how you got into mediation, that.
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, that's because I was totally disillusioned with the system of, there's a winner and a loser.
Yeah.
And in a negotiation and in mediation, good mediation is, there are little bits for everybody.
Yeah.
And I used to think when people said, well, after there was a settlement, we didn't really need you, that's fine. And I thought, yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Yeah. I love when you'd said about that. We have to keep reminding ourselves that this isn't about me. I think that's one of the hardest pieces, but again, a game changer when you're able to show up every time. And I have to remind myself all the time, every time I catch myself making it about me, it's like, okay, flip your lens, Cindy, right? Start as soon as I did, for me, at least I start asking questions. Then I get into a mode of, okay, how can I get more curious and find out about the other party and what they need? I think that's so important. And did you find go ahead. Sorry.
In terms of our society, even mediators, if you look, if you're looking for a mediator, people will look at ratings to see how many cases you've settled.
Yeah.
You have settled.
Yeah.
And that's the wrong way to look at it. But anyway, that's the way it is.
Actually, I'd love that. What would you say is the best indicator, the best template? If you're looking for a really good mediator, what should you be looking for?
I haven't given that a lot of thought, but off the top, it seems to me you might want to talk to some of the parties to see how they felt afterwards.
Absolutely.
And it's not that they thought it was a big win, but did they think it was fair or was the right one for them? Yeah. The right resolution for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that, finding the parties being able to come to a better solution. Like you were saying earlier about the old shows about it. And I've heard a lot of mediators go, well, I know I've done a great job if everybody's unhappy. And I'm like, well, surely that's not the goal, right? If there's a way for us to get people to recognize, you think you want this, I think I want that. When we get a little more vulnerable with each other, we recognize that there are all kinds of needs that we can meet for each other and come up with even better solutions. So I love your approach on that, Christine. And did you find any differences in politics in terms of negotiating in politics versus in law?
Oh, yeah. I was in politics at an interesting time. It was a minority government, and there had been an agreement between the Liberals and the New Democrats to get certain things done. And most of the time I was there, I was a parliamentary assistant, which meant kind of 2 seat of the minister on the political side. Yeah. And that meant I got to carry legislation through committee. So there's no minister there and you're in a minority. So things are moving along pretty quickly. So you get to negotiate, little me, got to negotiate what was going to change about this section in the law that's going to go, that was pretty exciting. Also a big responsibility for sure. Yeah. And a majority that never happens. It just was a moment in time. In law, and this was also true when I was running the ADR Center, negotiating with lawyers. I mean, there are nasty people everywhere, and there were certainly nasty lawyers I had to deal with. Yeah. And I'm sure you've had this too. Sometimes I felt as if I didn't have enough presence, so that they didn't come in assuming that, they're going to be able to walk all over me, even though I'm running the joint. Yeah. I don't know. I fuss about that. I don't know whether that's true, but those were negotiations that did not work because the only thing I could do was say, no, you can't come back. And that wasn't really on for me or anybody else. Those are kind of intractable negotiations. But in terms of regular negotiations with lawyers, if lawyers are coming to the table, I used to say that the best mediations were ones with prepared lawyers who understood what the process was. Yeah. There are quite a few who don't want to understand, but there's also quite a few who do understand and who do it well. And those are the ones that come up with the best resolutions. Yeah.
Well, and I love and thank you for your vulnerability here when you share about that. Geesh, I just, I wondered sometimes if I had enough presence. And I think we often, and as women in particular, believe that's the case. We take it on ourselves as if it's some shortcoming on us. And I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think there are certain differential treatment, shall we say, or expectations. And, they've done studies where they show participants, a photo of a boardroom, same people in the photo, but in one there's a woman at the head of the table and the other there's a male. And when they're asked to describe the person at the head of the table, both men and women end up describing the male in very complimentary terms. You know, you're strong, leader, charismatic, and the women in very unflattering terms. So I think we're moving in the right direction on that, but we've still got a way to go. But since you've mentioned that, I'd love to touch on, Christine, because and thank you for opening the door on that, about that presence piece. I think women tend to be more likely to shy away from negotiating generally, tied to some of that social conditioning we were talking about, and even more so advocating for themselves rather than other people. So I wondered, given all of your experience, like, what advice would you have for women in that category who tend to shy away and not perhaps step up and ask for what they want or self-advocate?
Some of it is we're socialized or we're more comfortable because of our personalities in not dealing with conflict averse, I think of it. In fact, someone told me that all mediators are conflict averse. I don't know if that's true, but it's a thought. And so that adding to our size, because we're typically smaller, not always these days. I have a daughter who's tall and lovely, but you know, and you are tall and lovely, but some of us are kind of little and sparse. And if you take that together with being fearful of conflict, that's a pretty normal thing, not just for women, but definitely for a lot of women. And how do you get over that? Again, I think it's practice and talking to yourself, and I don't know if some of us never get over that, or we don't think we're better than everybody else, but at least you have to kind of walk whatever that saying is, because you need that presence, you need that, it gives you a credibility. And I'm not talking about being, you know, overly aggressive or anything like that, but you need a way that you're comfortable with being while conflict's happening. I mean, some people, when a voice is raised, they run for the hills. Yeah,
that's true.
You know, and some enjoy that. I'm certainly not in that category, but there are people who are.
No, that's true. Well, and actually, to be honest, I grew up in a household where it was like passionate discussions. And I think sometimes friends came over and they were like so taken aback. And for us, it was fun. It was normal, right? But I love again that you've raised this issue about conflict, because at its heart, I think as a society, I look forward to the day when we can start reframing some of these things, right? Reframe how we define success and even conflict. Like the fact that you're saying some people say to you, oh, mediators are conflict averse. I think the opposite. I think the problem is the rest of us have bastardized what conflict even means. We see it as a fight, that it has to be a clash. It has to be opposing interests. What if we all start looking at conflict, as I think mediators do, as an opportunity? I think that's the beauty of mediation. And certainly I know from the work that you've done, I mean, you were able to get settlements in incredibly challenging situations because you were always looking for the opportunity and allowing the parties to come with a perspective to be seeking that opportunity. To me, that's a much more beautiful way to look at conflict, if you see it as an opportunity rather than a clash. So kudos to you. And would you have it?
So one thing that raises is parties are not always ready at the same time to do the work of negotiation or to negotiate at all. And I guess this would fall in the category of a tip, is I never felt it was a failing on my part if the mediation ended. Because I always left it saying, you know, here's where we are today. Let's acknowledge that. And, you know, go and think about it. And then if you want to come back, then here's what we can do. And we can either talk to you individually or talk to you together. Leaving the door open really is the tip, because there will be a time, quite likely, when they are ready.
Yeah. And timing's so important and so often undervalued. And I think lawyers in particular, we tend to forget that. And it's interesting to me because as kids, intuitively, we knew how important timing was, right? Like you knew not to bug your parents for something if they were in a bad mood, you know, it was like, pick your timing. And so I think that's a really powerful tip, actually, is to be conscious of the timing when you set it. If you're going to have a difficult conversation, choose your timing strategically, and also recognize that other people, as you say, get to those places at different times. So yeah, I think super powerful. And I'm wondering, when you're giving us some of these tips about shying away, would you have any different advice for women in law versus, women in politics versus their personal lives? Or do you think that the principles are the same across the board?
Pretty much the same. Obviously there's context. And you have to pick your time always, like in politics.
Yeah.
Like there's no point in picking a time when the electorate is totally again something that you want to have happen. That doesn't mean it's off the table forever, but it's off the table right now.
Yeah.
So.
And do you find there's more increased willingness to engage in ADR, like alternative dispute resolution? Because I find, like, even recently in a couple of my interviews, I've kind of scratched my head with like really well-respected lawyers who are talking about, I go to mediation and I don't actually intend to settle. I'm going there as a fact gathering expedition because my role is a litigator and my clients want me to litigate. And I'm like, that just seems so short-sighted to me when you can get better outcomes, better buy-in, longer lasting agreements. And, in litigation, even the so-called winners come out, feel like they've just been, starring alongside Russell Crowe and Gladiator, right? I mean, it's just a horrible process. So I'd love your thoughts on whether, are we seeing an increased recognition about the importance of mediation and alternative dispute resolution mechanisms?
No.
Disheartening, but I appreciate your honesty.
There was, there was a time, there was a brief and shining moment when we were experimenting with the courts and other people were experimenting elsewhere with mediation, different forms of dispute resolution. And yes, we did get quite a few resolutions, way more than we had before at an earlier stage in the litigation. But the problem was lawyers didn't get paid as much.
Yeah.
Because where they get paid, they don't even go to court these days, is through discovery. And our resolutions were before discovery. Yeah. So that's part of it. Not to say that every lawyer is grasping, but those firms, they have to get their nut. The other thing is our law schools, U of T, they keep asking me for money. I graduated from there. Yeah. And I say, when you have a course in mediation, I will give you money. Oh, wow. They have a course in arbitration, which is just like being a judge. Yeah. And so it's where lawyers are comfortable. It's just like a court, only a private court. Yeah. They still do not train lawyers in, I think they have negotiation, but it's lawyers' role in negotiation as opposed to where you would think lawyers' role in mediation might be important. Yeah. Quite different from arbitration. No, quite disheartened by that. No question about that. Now it's just in the court, it's just considered a hurdle by lawyers, and they use it as extra discovery. That's it. Yeah. Okay. Well, and again, for our listeners out there, I mean, it's great advice. People need to start speaking up and looking for something different and raising our awareness about these issues. Because if we keep going back to more and more confrontational models, if we keep buying into that win-lose mentality, whether in law, in politics, in your personal relationships, you are not going to be able to you're not going to be the best version of yourself. You're not going to be able to get the most creative outcomes. You're not going to get the best relationships or buy-in or long-lasting agreements. So really something profound you've left us with to think about there, Christine. Now, you had mentioned there's one other thing, and that I'm sorry to jump in, Cindy.
No, absolutely.
Women are not all women. Barracudas out there. Yeah. But many women who choose mediation as a way of earning their living are very good at it. Yeah. And more women than men. And as a result, it's become devalued. Interesting. I'm sorry to say that, but that is true. And I don't quite know how to get around that. There are lots of men who are, quote, mediators who essentially they essentially decide what the decision is. And many of them are former judges are like that, but that's, you can forgive them. That's what they did. Yeah. But others, I think they could do better than that.
Yeah. Well, and again, thanks for speaking to the elephants in the room here today, because I think that's a really important, I hadn't actually thought about it, that the devaluation of it. I think it's one of the things that inspired me to write Art of Feminine Negotiation was this mission about, and I was very intentional about using the word feminine. I'd agonized over it, but to the extent that we keep sort of stifling and trivializing our feminine, and both men and women, when we see our feminine as a liability, we need to shift. Like for me, the mission is about, let's start shifting the mindsets around that, elevate the awareness about it. So I'm really appreciative that you called that out and speak to, because I think we need to be having these discussions and recognizing the extent to which unconscious gender bias still so profoundly informs how we show up and what we do. And we really see that, I think, in bullying, which is something you mentioned earlier about people showing up and bullying. Over your career, is there any advice or tips that you'd have for, what you found to be more effective ways of negotiating with bullies or people with more power?
Starting on the schoolyard with my little kid. And I actually learned a great deal about that bullying from the schoolyard stuff. I used to try and do the same. We practice, like she was, and it was both racist and bullying, but she was tiny and bigger kids thought she was kind of a mark.
Yeah.
And to teach her how to practice it, just as I did role playing myself when I was in politics, about the things that she could say that, would stop it, as opposed to running to the teacher where you're then tarred forever.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I was ever totally successful in dealing with lawyer bullies, and there were lots of them. Well, I guess I voted with my feet. That's one of the things that I did.
That's important. Yeah. Knowing when to walk away. Absolutely. I think
I was involved in a number of studies. The first one was Bertha Wilson's study back in the early 80s, I think it was, why women are leaving the practice of law.
Yeah.
And then I was later on as well. And it was not to have children. And they're still leaving in droves. Because why would you want to work there? That's the problem. It's a culture that's antithetical to family life, for example, for anybody who wants to do anything else other than practice law. But what Madam Justice Wilson, and ultimately I did too, find was that women started their own businesses. They were certainly in the workforce doing all kinds of stuff that just was not practicing law because it was not fun.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting when you say about business, I think women entrepreneurs, it is the single fastest growing group right now, are women looking to start business. And I love that you mentioned about role play, because I think people don't do that very often. And I think they get kind of uncomfortable about trying it, but there is incredible value as part of, you had talked about preparation earlier, Christine. I think having some pat phrases sort of in your pocket, if you will, that you're ready, that, when confronted with this kind of approach, I know I can say this. It can be tremendously valuable. Like if you're dealing with a bully, even just being able to say, I know that treating people with dignity and respect is important to you, so I'm not sure what's happening here. Something like that can be a very powerful way. Just have that ready. And when they're being the worst version of themselves, most people, that I find will often shock them out of complacency. So they'll show up a little bit differently, right? So I love that you did that with your daughter. And I think it's great advice for our listeners. Have some phrases, practice this stuff yourself, right? I mean, practice in the mirror, think about it, practice with friends so that you can show up in a more empowered state and you won't have that shell-shocked reaction when it happens. And I'd love, you had talked about preparation. What are some other, what do you see as some of the most important elements of preparation in your view?
Sleep.
Yeah, it's true. Very true. I think
I can say that since I've reached an age where sleep is sort of a real luxury. No, that is important. We lead very, very fragmented lives, all of us. And to, kind of rush into the meeting where the negotiation is and your mind's on 6 or 7 different things and your phone and your screen and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't work. You really need to find even a few minutes to kind of calm yourself down and breathe and, why am I here and all that kind of stuff. I'm not talking about hours or going to the spa or anything like that, but that's really important.
Yeah, that's great advice. I love that sleep. And even just that, because you talked about 2 things there, like that sleep, like getting rest, having, and as lawyers, sometimes we become so focused only on our careers. And I think other people in business as well, just so focused. It's all about the almighty dialer, which for most people, if you ask them what the priorities are in life, that wouldn't be it. And yet that's where we spend the most of our time. So creating space for yourself to just can be valuable. But I also love, Christine, that you touched on there, just in the moment when you're in a situation, just allow yourself that time to just take a breath and reground yourself can be so valuable. You'd mentioned emotion earlier. We all have emotions and they are going to come up. So just allow yourself that moment to pause before you get triggered or respond and choose. We can't control what happens, but we can choose how we respond in a situation. So I think that's such great advice. And what do you see as the key reasons that negotiations fail?
Oh, there are quite a few.
Listening, you mentioned clearly that would
Not
be, I
listening
imagine,
for
part of
sure.
your-
Somebody coming in, particularly legal counsel, coming in with the idea that it's going to fail.
Yeah.
You know, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Lawyers muzzling their clients. They're, you know, can't talk, so you can't listen if they won't talk. And sometimes some of them are just, I've mediated some estate matters, and they are family matters, essentially.
Yeah.
They are so dug in. I've mediated estate matters with people in their 80s, and their siblings, and they're fighting over how their parents treated them.
Yeah.
You know, there's just some issues. It's not that you can't ever get over them, and you aim to make them a little better, maybe they'll resolve.
Yeah.
But some are just intractable.
Yeah.
Now, ones you might think are intractable, such as constitutional matters, you would think, oh, you can't possibly mediate those. Yes, you can. You can narrow them down to the best possible issue that's going to go to a court or a reference.
Yeah.
You can, you know, have the parties understand what's at stake for all of this. So there are lots of issues that you can helpfully negotiate.
Yeah.
Even if the goal is to send the right case to the Supreme Court of Canada, you know, that might be the goal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I like that you talk about that piece about when people come in and they're intractable, to not be able to, that mindset piece around it, right? Because there is a certain law of attraction. When we show up in a particular way with a certain expectation, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So why not show up with the best possible expectations for the best possible outcomes? I think that's so powerful. And on the other,
just to interrupt for a sec, there are not many of like that. I mean, I mentioned that estate one because it sticks with me, and it was years ago. And there was a deadline, a financial deadline. They were going to lose millions of dollars if they didn't hit the deadline, and they let it go. Wow. So, but that's very unusual. Yeah. It's, you know, most people want to come to some sort of resolution and get on with their lives. They don't, because they're fussing about it and, you know, worrying and spending time and money. So that is an unusual circumstance. Yeah.
Although I think you really touched on the core, because really what you're speaking in those cases, it's that human baggage that we bring to the table, right? Yeah. When we bring that emotion, and, you know, I often say, you know, you bring the emotion of your deep why to the table, but don't be emotional. But when people get into a negotiation and there's those wounds we still have as kids that we carry with us, if we haven't done the inner work to resolve that, you will keep being in patterns of failures in these negotiations. So I get that. Now, what do you think are the key hallmarks that you would say make for a great negotiator? What are some of the skills that people should be aspiring to have if they want to up their negotiation game?
Empathy.
Yes.
You know, and it's great if you have it, but it's something that can be cultivated for sure. And it doesn't mean that you're, you know, emoting all over your people you're negotiating with, but it does help you to listen better and to walk in your opposite party's shoes, because that's really what you're trying to do. Yeah. And a great negotiator, one who doesn't trumpet being a great negotiator. Like the best ones I know don't say, you know, my kill rate is such and such, and you will hear that about mediators, which blows my mind. But anyway, they can change tack. Like if you see that something isn't going well, you can either break the parties apart or send them out for coffee or have them have a meal together. That's very powerful, powerful that they break bread together. So having lots of ways of having people come together, you know, that's what a great negotiator does.
That's beautiful. And I love that changing tack. So simple, and yet not done very effectively by most people. Most people have a go-to and they stay on that. And I like sometimes something as simple, just changing the tone of your voice, changing the speed at which you speak, like just slow down the pace, lose some of that frenetic energy, right? Because I mean, I talk fast and I walk fast, and I have to get very intentional sometimes about, because that can create tension, particularly if you're dealing with people on the other side, whether they're introverted or just a slower pace, just getting really intentional to be able to change that tack, as you say. And I love that you named empathy as the sort of single most important. I think it is so undervalued as a skill set, and we have been conditioned to see it as a weakness when nothing could be.
Because it's female.
Yeah.
It's not female actually, but it has been, our society assigns it to females.
Yeah. And I love that because again, for me, that was a big part of the art of feminine negotiation. I'm like, God, when you really start looking at the skills of rapport building and empathy and flexibility and intuition and trust building, all of the things that really matter to be an effective negotiator, most of those are skills people consider to be feminine traits. And yet we continue to stifle our feminine, somehow thinking that's going to be the path. It won't allow us the path to success, which just makes no sense. So
Yeah, I have one other thing. People used to say to me, "Oh, you do change so well." That was the buzzword at one time. And I thought to myself, I did not say, I should have said, yeah, well, I kind of had to, because you get fired or you're not hired back, or, you don't fit the mold or whatever.
yes.
So you have to change. I
Yeah.
didn't necessarily want to know how to do change, but I do it.
Well, and on that, speaking, because you'd mentioned, we've been talking a couple of times now about lawyers leaving the practice in droves. I think lawyers generally and women in particular. Do you have any advice for lawyers how they can live more on, and in business for that matter too, but to live more on purpose, right? Avoid that constant sort of soul sucking fight mode that we've been conditioned to see as success in law and politics and business. Any advice for how to be more purpose driven in how you practice?
I actually have been thinking about this in terms of family doctors too, because they are also leaving in droves. It's a tough one because the financial incentives are such that you're encouraged just work, just get on that treadmill and go. Same for doctors, that fee for service thing is like iniquitous.
Yeah.
It really, I guess part of it is to the change has to be that you do not want to earn your first $1 million by the time you're 40 or whatever the goal is. That was certainly true for me because I had the great good fortune of being brought up where there was not an expectation that I would earn a lot of money.
Yeah.
There wasn't even really an expectation that I would get married. Everybody else had that expectation at the time, but that was not a huge goal in my family. Now, for many others, it has to be a goal because you have to look after yourself, feed your family, all that kind of stuff. But once you let go, and I think the pandemic taught many of us that, once you let go of that, I don't have to be able to shop at a certain store, and shopping retail is not my vacation, that kind of stuff. That enables you to look at things a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the pandemic, and it wasn't a good thing in lots of ways, but certainly because people died, but some good things did come out of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you're seeing more retirements now earlier. And you're seeing more entrepreneurial activity, people thinking, well, I like to be closer to home to do, put the dog out or pick up the kids or whatever. Yeah. But I can also start a business or, do something else. Yeah. I think that reduction in expectation of money down the road, I think lawyers have that. No question, not everyone, but too many of us do. Yeah. And if you kind of lowered that expectation, I think you would find different ways of practicing. Lawyers did practice differently. Yeah. The docket came in with me. That was in early 70s. Before the docket, an hour of time was not a unit of money, right? Right. Yes. But it is now, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I love that you talk. First, I think that's incredibly powerful advice on many levels. And since you've mentioned about docketing, it's funny. One of the exercises I often do, and I think this is so closely tied, and I want to really hit this point for our listeners, because I think Christine has just offered the biggest gold nugget in terms of finding a better life balance is here's money is the one goal. It's like we are so conditioned in law school in particular, I think, and in business schools and communities, that is the almighty holy grail. And yet, as lawyers, we docket our time, for those who don't know, in 6-minute increments. So, every hour has 60 minutes. So 0.1 is 6 minutes. And I have my sort of coaching clients track what they do over the course of a week, like a lawyer, right? Where you try, and I invite for all of our listeners, if you're already a lawyer, do it in your personal life, where all of your time is going. And then at the end, the first realization is that the majority of our time is going to things that we would not consider priorities in our life, as we talked about earlier. So I love the point that you're making, Christine, about money, because part of it is about de-emphasizing the need to make more money. But that a lot of people will be resistant, going, well, I don't want to make less money. But tied to that, you're increasing the value of the things that actually matter to you. So what are the most important priorities in your life right now and take a look at how much time you're actually building in to do those things that matter most to you. It's a real game changer. And then when you see where all of your time is going, find ways to start eliminating, delegating, automating, get those things off your list that don't fill your boat. So thank you for that.
No, well, the docketing is iniquitous.
Yeah.
Because it equates so many minutes, 6 minutes.
Yeah.
As a unit of productivity for the client.
Yeah.
It's not at all.
Yeah.
That's just a management tool.
Yeah.
And so it's valued by the managers of the firm, and you don't docket when you are training lawyers, when you're doing community pro bono work, all kinds of things like that. So it disincentivizes young lawyers or lawyers at all in doing anything other than that kind of time. And when they can't, unfortunately, it's an incentive to pad the docket.
Yeah. Yes.
So the clients suffer.
Yeah. And I think there is a movement, particularly with younger lawyers now. I'm seeing more in some of the social media platforms like Clubhouse and that. You're seeing this real call to arms about getting rid of the docketing system and replacing it. So there is hope, perhaps, that we'll start seeing systems in place that are a little better. I can't believe how quick our time has gone here today. I could talk to you all day about this stuff. You've given such brilliant insights. I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? It doesn't have to be about this issue at all, just something where you changed how you thought about and it improved your life by having this particular shift.
Oh, you're not going to like this, Cindy.
Okay.
The biggest mindset shift came when we adopted our baby and I was 50.
Yeah.
And it changed my way. First of all, I had been practicing law for many years, politician, all that kind of stuff. So I brought more to it, I think. We'll ask my daughter about that.
Yep.
And it changed my way of looking at the world in so many ways. It enriched my way of looking at the world. And I became a better mediator, I think. Yeah. Because much of my mediating was done after that in order to work around my baby's schedule, right?
Yeah.
So that's it. Being a mom.
I think that's beautiful. No, I think that's beautiful, actually. And I do. And for me, that actually ties in again very much to this mission that I sort of am personally on about. I do think we need to start really valuing some of those sort of feminine, and that maternal instinct is part of that as well, right? And recognizing the value of looking at the world through that different lens, a lens of collaboration, a lens that moves us away from competition and winning and losing. And I do agree with you. I think that when we are open to it, certainly, for some, it'll be having kids that does that, but whatever it is for you to get you to switch into that mindset and have a broader perspective, I think is a gorgeous thing. So I love that answer, actually. Well, thank you so much, Christine, for being with us. You've shared such gold. It has been an absolute pleasure having you here.
I loved it. Thank you for asking me.
Yes. And for our listeners out there, I have no doubt that you got loads of value from this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and make sure to share with anyone that you think could get some value from this message. And so many incredible avenues and aspects of negotiation and life lessons that we've talked about here today. Make sure that you give the gift of sharing and allow other people to benefit from some of the incredible gold nuggets that Christine Hart has shared with us here today, because who could not benefit from this approach to life? And also, just before we sign off, I want to invite any of you to look into, if you're interested in up-leveling your negotiation skills, make sure to reach out, check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com. I have one-on-one programs, group programs, online programs, a range of services available to help you step up to get more of what you want and deserve in life. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so that you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.